George Kilpatrick, inspiration for the nation celebrating people we feel good about. October is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we have partnered with Vera House to share some of the stories and the tools that they use to help survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and other forms of abuse. We also remind you that there is a 24-hour hotline at 315-468-3260 that you can call at any time during this conversation should you need support. And so we're pleased to be joined by two of the members of the Vera House Survivors Network. Angela Douglas is the co-chair of the Survivors Network, and Marc Martin is a member of the Survivors Network. And the Survivors Network, Angela, has been around not too long in terms of the Vera House legacy. So let's talk about how that was created and when it was created.
So it was created in 2016, and essentially a large group of, a few staff and a large group of survivors wanted to be able to respond to some things, recognize that they wanted to be able to educate and bring voice into the community, and also provide support for each other. And so in 2016, the Survivors Network was birthed out of Vera House. And so it has been in just the formation years. We're only in 2020, so that's just 4 years ago. And so it's been over the last 4 years just working to figure out what's the best way for us to work. There's many passionate people around the table. It's actually a very large group. Right now, we've got about 70 members, although not all of us show up at every single monthly meeting, but there is a large contingency of us that show up and do multiple things, such as presentations. We participate significantly in the report to the community that Vera House does every year. We actually help to lead and design some of that, as well as various opportunities in the community to raise the awareness around issues. Last year, we worked with Syracuse University and a few of the media outlets to talk about having trauma-informed investigation. We are looking also to do some work with the medical field. And how can we help medical professionals better understand what it's like for a victim survivor to show up in their office and have to go with what seems to be really regular and mundane procedures, but that can be triggering and very difficult for victims and survivors. So we're doing a lot of different things. COVID has changed that. We've been now meeting virtually. Marc is a phenomenal also leader in our group, arranged for us to do some walking on the canal and getting together. So we're recognizing that, one, through the Me Too movement and then now into what is our COVID living, that the needs of survivors and victims change, and many things can trigger both physical and emotional responses that we really want to kind of work through. Our goal is to promote healing and to give voice to the process and to the pain.
Well, now I don't have any more questions because you pretty much answered all of them, but that's fine. We're gonna walk through some of them and break some of those down. But no, that was great. There's two things that you said that I wanted to just piggyback on and have you say more about, because it's easy for me to understand in the work, but for those who are listening, you said you've been working with law enforcement and the medical community to be more trauma informed. Say more about what that exactly means, as especially as it relates to working with survivors.
Yes, and it was actually last year was our event that we did with Syracuse University and several of the media outlets around trauma-informed investigation and interviewing, which is really what we were looking for. So trauma-informed is recognizing and putting at the center the experiences of people who have been traumatized. And it doesn't necessarily have to be around domestic violence or sexual assault. There's all kinds of trauma and which we've been experiencing in our community and in our country. And so trauma informed means I am recognizing that this person has gone through an experience that may have affected them in ways that I cannot physically see on their body. And so it may mean I have to to use social distancing differently, right? I may need to provide more space. I may need to talk about things in ways that are helpful to the person, and also watch for them who, when they may emotionally have a reaction to something either I'm asking or that I'm doing. The other thing is also, we always say, allowing the survivor and the victim to really drive what's happening. And that ultimately, because autonomy is so important to us, whether it's in our body or in our life, when other people have been controlling that, that us being able to say, no, I don't want to talk any further, or I need a minute, or I need to come back to that. That's not something I can share about right now. Or could we do this differently? So in the medical field, having a sense of what each patient needs, because here's the other piece about being trauma informed: it's different based on every single victim and survivor. And so being able to have a conversation and talk with victims and survivors about what their needs are and how, what needs to get done, right? In medical procedures, there's things that need to get done, but how
Right.
can we do that in a way that helps them to stay present in the moment, that helps them to not fight the procedure, or to become so withdrawn that they're unable to engage and participate with medical professionals, so to speak.
So, Mark, how would you describe your journey?
I'll tell you, George. Um, I had been abused from childhood, and in adulthood, I took what I learned, unfortunately, in childhood and abused myself for a number of years. I ended up in relationships that were highly abusive, including the very last relationship, my last marriage that I was in. The domestic violence, the domestic abuse was extremely charged in that relationship.
Yeah, and Mark, one of the things as I'm listening to you and thinking about it, how did you, how difficult is it for men to confront this in their relationships? Because oftentimes that's not something that, as male identified, we're comfortable doing. So how did you get to the point where you were able to begin to recognize that something wasn't right for you?
It took a long time. There were a number of incidences that happened over the years that caused me to reach out for help. And I got responses that were basically, you're, um, the way that I took it was that I'm not the right type of person that gets abused. So
Mm.
we don't have anything available for you. I ran into that for a number of years, actually.
When you say you're not the right type of person, meaning you weren't a woman, or is that what you mean?
Yeah, because a lot of the services that were available were geared towards women and not towards men.
Mm-hmm.
And me coming forward to say that, hey, I'm in the same type of situation, it made it extremely difficult for me because the feedback that I got was, we don't know how to handle you. We don't have the ability to handle you. We're sorry this is happening to you. And I was pretty much left to the side.
And of course that made you even more frustrated and more. It's almost like you were re-abused in some ways.
Absolutely. And what changed for me was when I moved here to Syracuse 5 years ago. I had an incident happen. I was introduced to Vera House, and the very first meeting that I had from a representative from Vera House face to face, she listened to what I had to say. She listened to my story. And not only did she listen, she said, I think I can help you. That was the very first time I ever had somebody say to me that they think they could help me.
Mm, mm.
And that was the start of my relationship with Vera House. And it's been a whirlwind of 5 years, I'll tell you that. But it has been the best 5 years of my life.
What I find interesting about your story, Mark, is that you said that you had been seeking help but couldn't find it. So I just that's striking to me. and you also describe being abused as a child. So not only that, just not being able to get support for that. Is it comfortable for you to talk about what happened to you?
It is comfortable to an extent, yes. When I was growing up, the abuse I received early on was more um, verbal and emotional. And after the family moved from um, from a northern state to a southern state, the family was my family of origin was isolated from the rest of my larger family.
Mm-hmm.
And in that isolation, the abuse ramped up significantly. It became more physical, it became sexual as I reached maturity. And that made life very uncomfortable for me.
And certainly, we're glad that you found the support that you needed. What do you say to other men who may be like you, who may not be able to express as you have what you're experiencing or admit that they're in an abusive relationship? What do you say to them about how they might want to reach out and start to get help?
I think what I would say to them is don't give up. If you feel like you're being abused, if it's especially violence, for example, as it was in my case for a period of time, that speak up, say something, find the right people to talk to, contact Vera House or contact an organization like Vera House that will be able to help you, that will listen to you and maybe provide you the resources you need to remove yourself from that situation.
What about shame and guilt and all those kinds of feelings?
Oh man, there's a tipping point for me there. I felt a lot of shame for a number of years. I felt like I was the cause of what I
Mm.
was feeling for so long, that I was the cause of the problems that the people around me were experiencing. And it wasn't until coming through Vera House and going through basically the recovery that I went through with Vera House that I learned that none of this was my fault.
Mm.
And that helped peel away those layers of shame.
And Angela, you have a number of different roles in Vera House. I should also say you're the associate director of Vera House. But what you also have a journey. What was your journey?
Mm. Yeah, so the sad part, but the good part, I always call my journey horribly beautiful, is that I have survived many things from childhood sexual assaults starting at age 4, lasting until I was about 13. I have survived an on campus rape in my first college and an assault in the second college. And I think what was more defining for me than all of that was the generational domestic violence that had existed in my family and in my families for many, many years. When I say generationally, it appears to be that it's gone on for quite some time. So, that really informed my life. And I think in the beginning of my years, I minimized that.
Mm.
And rather than what's a little bit different with Mark and I is that I was taught to never be a victim of anything, as if the victim was a powerless place,
Mm-hmm.
and that you were a survivor and you were going to recover and you were going to do well, right?
Mm-hmm.
My mother was, you are strong and you are a woman and you will always overcome in many ways, is what she was saying to me. And it wasn't actually until I was able to participate in the Survivors Network and another member had shared how their journey of being called a victim was so powerful. And I was like, what in the heck? I'm like, I'm not a victim. And I rumbled with that for a very long time until I realized that there was power in that. And similar to Mark talking about the shame and realizing it's not my fault, there was this thing that I realized in so many aspects of my life where I feel like I had failed. If I really traced back what some of those failures were, it was the beating up of myself all of the time, that I wasn't perfect enough, I wasn't doing hard enough, I wasn't this and that, whatever. Well, when I traced all of that and rumbled with it, what it came down to was I was a victim and I was robbed of many things over my
Mm-hmm.
life.
Mm.
And if I could acknowledge that someone took something from me and that I was robbed from that, that those things showed up in other ways of my life that I couldn't necessarily control. That became a very powerful and healing place for me, which is why now I always identify myself as a victim survivor. I am a victim. I was a victim. I'm a victim of many things. In fact, it was actually just a couple of years ago, I was sexually harassed on a golf course here locally by two gentlemen who had consumed too much alcohol. And I was sitting alone in the golf cart at a benefit. And so even that was hard. Like I had just started my job at Vera House and I was like, oh my gosh, like how do you tell people? And I didn't tell people for a while. So these things happen, and it is that shame, and it is really, I think, also the lack of control that you have around how things get talked about and the image of things. And I think also some of the rhetoric and narrative that gets put at survivors and victims, which is, aren't you over that yet? Or, oh,
Mm-hmm.
that was so long ago. Or, how much longer are you going to kind of have to deal with that way? And so I really worked a long time to be able to just embrace the idea that I had been victimized. Um, that I do not, for me, always, I do not believe that um, my perpetrators inherently always meant to destroy me as a human being. I felt like they were really also very broken human beings because of some of the trauma that they had lived through.
Yeah, let me ask you, did either of you get what you might describe as justice for what happened to you?
No, I've never tried to seek justice. I've tried to just separate myself from my abuser as completely as possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about you, Angela?
So in the traditional sense of justice in the court system, no.
Right.
I had spent a long time wanting to be a lawyer and doing the justice work. Um, but I am actually an alternative dispute resolution. That's in my heart and core. And so for me, it was about restorative. And because many of the perpetrators are family or friends or um, I actually also had a neighbor. I just separated myself from those I could. And then others, I just chose to forgive. For me, it was much more of a faith and spiritual path that I took. And that to me was justice. It just didn't look the same way.
Let me ask you about family, but also in the context of being a woman of color and how that shows up in terms of keeping the family secrets, if you will. Can you say
Oh,
something
yeah.
about that, and how that impacts how you rumble, if you will, with how you react to being victimized, and what that says to you about the need to keep it in the family without going public?
Yeah, that's a very deep and profound thing. Like I just was like, oh, there was like a shift for me, because you're not supposed to talk about things outside of the family. What's happens here stays here. It's not discussed. And I think, so I get why. So as a young person, I didn't get why. As an adult, I get the why. And the why I get is because um the the trauma, the pain, and the destruction that can come externally to families of color, right? That's called how CPS historically has been involved. It is how law enforcement has been involved. I remember when I was a child, and my father abused my mother, and my father was an amazing man. He is also a Vietnam vet, a very complicated life. And yet my mother had called the police, and she had gotten an order of protection. And the police knew my dad, loved my dad, but they had to arrest him, and they did. And I remember him calling me from jail crying, and it was devastating to me. And I also knew that as my mother, being a white woman, struggled deeply, that was not a route that she originally had wanted to go, because we are also very aware of how Black males in law enforcement and in jails and how that works. We have real living experience with that. And so I'm going to say the thing that I think I've heard many people, races, ethnicities, colors, say: I really just want the abuse to stop. I love them. I love them. I want to be with them. I just want them to be healthy and be able to exist together. The problem is, though, that for women of color, once there is external involvement, we are also often seen as the perpetrator. And I think for Black men who are receiving a lot of abuse, there is no ability to see them in Marc's position, right? So Marc, I think, has a little bit of an opportunity to speak to men, but for a Black man to come out and say that he's a victim is also, I think you would see that far, far less because of the external pressure.
And yet, the very thing that you describe is also what keeps some families in color in trauma, because they're not able to have an outlet to
Absolutely.
tell their truth. So that's a
Absolutely.
vicious cycle. So
It is.
what do you say, both of you? I love your response to this. To someone watching or listening to this, to someone who's now listening to the two of you boldly tell your truth, and they've been struggling with their own truth or secret or family secret, and they have held on to it, and that has shown up in other ways in their lives, right? With maybe broken relationships, alcohol, drugs, weight, that because they have not been able to process. What would you say to that person who's listening or watching this right now about how they can manage the truth or secret that they have not been able to share with anyone?
I will say first, it is terrifying to speak out for the very first time. I don't know how I did it. I did. But finding the right person to talk to that is going to listen to you, somebody that you feel safe and comfortable with, is a key, a very big key to speaking out for the first time.
And that could be anybody, even if it's a professional, but it also could be somebody you trust, right? I mean, I think that's the key, right? Being able to
Absolutely.
to tell somebody you trust. Angela, what would you say to that?
I also think that it's as small or as big as you want it to be. It doesn't have to be a public statement. I wrestled for a long time before being publicly videoed or interviewed about that, because I hadn't discussed it with my family.
Mm-hmm.
I had to make some real decisions. Most people who knew me professionally had no clue the history that I had had. And so just talking about it, as Marc said, with one person is the first step. A lot of victim survivors come to the network thinking and seeking some peer camaraderie, a way of supporting others telling their story. But at some point, you do have to decide, what do I want to say about my life? What do I want to say about my story? Do you have children? Your children should know. I think it was very humbling to me to have my children hear my story and receive it in the way that they did. They were amazing and precious about that. So I don't think it has to be I go on TV and tell everyone. I don't think it has to be I march down to the wherever and tell. It can be calling our hotline. It can be having a chat conversation with someone here. You can be anonymous. It can start that way. It also can say, I really can't suffer in this any longer, and I need help, and I need someone to do that journey with me. And then reaching out to a place like Vera House, or a friend, or a faith leader or friend who you know, whoever that is, Mark said, you can trust. And one of the things I do think, though, is sometimes we don't even know who we can trust.
Mm-hmm.
And so just being even real about that.
Well, let me speak to that for real quick, because you said, who can I trust? And oftentimes what victims or survivors are told is, if you tell anyone, I'm going to threaten your life. If you tell anyone, nobody's going to believe you, or your reputation, and then you have to be a perfect victim, right? You may have been in a relationship with this person, but then they started to abuse you, and then that's not believed. Or the people you trust, clergy or law enforcement, can be the very people that are perpetrating the victimhood against you or perpetrating the crime against you. So that also complicates things. When it's the person you trust, that's also the person who's abusing you.
I think that's the complexity of this, George, which is why I'm always cautioning. Let me say it this way. When I answer crisis calls here at Vera House, and I think it's one of the things I think people think oftentimes when you're the associate director, the executive director, Randy spends a lot of time answering crisis calls. It doesn't take up a majority of our
Yeah.
day, but we do it. Um, the things that I hear from people who call our line about the conversations that they've tried to have with the important people in their life and how they have disappointed them and failed them is great.
Mm.
And so I think that is more traumatizing. I think it is more painful. And sometimes it's better to be with a stranger than it is to be with someone who's very close to you. Sometimes the safe and trusted person isn't the person who's next to you. It's sometimes not your mom, your dad, your cousin, your best friend, your whomever. Sometimes you need an objective outside human that can hear you, who can be with you, and then who can also say, I hear you, I believe you, and you know what? This doesn't have to be the way you spend your life.
Mark, I can see you and I can hear you shaking your head on the other side of the. Uh,
Yes,
what Angela is saying is ringing true for you.
yes. I sought outside help. The people in my close knit network, friends, family, much of them didn't believe what I had to say. And it wasn't until I reached outside of and talked to people whom I did not know, but felt like I needed to trust somebody. And those were the people that I did talk to, that I did trust, and that were able to reason with me and help me see that, yeah, you need help.
I just want to reiterate to the people who are watching and listening how important what the two of you are saying is around the support that they can get right at Vera House. So let me just pause real quick and give people the information that they need. So verahouse.org, and I do this too, you can actually go on and have a chat with someone. We're up to date now and offering that service to you. And so you can do verahouse.org and you can chat with somebody, or you can call the 24-hour hotline, and that can be wherever you are in the journey. It could be to talk about this for the first time to someone that you've never said anything to, and begin your healing journey. And Mark, you said something earlier, or Angela alluded to the fact that you organized the group to do a walk on the Erie Canal path. And what that reminded me of, before we go, because we could talk to you guys for hours and hours, is how do you take care of yourself when you are re-traumatized or triggered. Even this conversation could be triggering for the two of you. And so how are you going to take care of yourself? How do you take care of yourself? And I'm also asking this for the person who's listening, who again may or may not have ever told anybody that they have been that they've been victimized. How do you take care of yourself? Because I know that part of the journey includes self-harm because you don't know how to take care of yourself. So I'll leave that with that. The two of you, Mark, you can start and then Angela finish up, and then we'll have to wrap because again, I could talk to you guys forever.
Absolutely. There are a couple of things that I do very regularly. One, when I am traumatized, I get up and I remove myself from whatever room I'm in and walk into another room. That alone is usually enough to alter my brain to say, okay, I need to think about something else. Another thing that I like to do is journal. I like to write down what my thoughts are, what's going on inside of my head when I'm traumatized. A lot of times when I read back what I've written, I try to make sense of what I've written because a lot of times it just doesn't make any sense when it's in my head.
Right.
And a third thing that I like to do is just get out and take a walk.
Mm-hmm.
Getting out in nature, getting outside, getting the sun beating on your face is usually enough to make a change physically for myself to alter my consciousness enough to where that trauma doesn't have a lasting impact on me.
Angela?
So I agree with everything Mark said. But there's two parts to this that I think too. There is the self-care and there's the resiliency building. And I know, George, we talk about this a lot. I had to learn that there's also a long game. And so what things was I going to do to increase my health and well-being, because the stronger I am in terms of my health and well-being, actually emotionally and mentally, I can respond to what's happening. So while I have the things that when I'm traumatized, I go to, I usually pray. I usually also Mark, I call it locating myself. Like, where am I right now? What room am I in? What am I doing? What am I hearing? What do I need to move away from? But then there's the long thing, the long game, meaning there was a point when I could afford next to nothing. And I made a decision I was going to buy a $5 bottle of vitamins from Walmart. And that was for me a huge amount. That was a huge thing. And it was a huge thing of self-care. And it was, I'm going to take care of my body. I'm going to take care of my body. I'm going to, even though it was harmed, even though my trauma response is to go out of my body, we call it floating head. And I realized I lived most of my life not in my body because it was always consumed by other people and not me. So to be able to say, I'm going to be in my body and I'm going to take care of my body and I'm going to sleep and I'm going to tell my family that I need certain hours of sleep and I'm going to drink water, not because I like it, but because I know it makes me feel better. And I didn't always have a lot of control to do a lot of things, but I found that those things I could have control in and I felt better. So self-care is also about kind of, what are we doing to kind of bring ourselves back? But I would say self-care is also, trauma rewires your brain and trauma harms your body. And if we're not careful, sickness and disease will show up in our body because of the trauma we've had. And so I just encourage us all to think about, it has many effects and lasting effects, but we can reverse them.
Verbal, psychological, emotional, physical, sexual are all forms of abuse, and those are all ways in which you can get support at verahouse.org or by calling 24-hour hotline 315-468-3260. We've only scratched the surface. Angela, how do people become members of the Survivors Network?
So they can go online and they can actually request. There's a little email there and say, I'd like to join. You can give us a call. We meet the first or the second Saturday of the month. We meet virtually now. And then we've been doing some outside activities, socially distanced and masked, so that we could be in physical space together. We're also going to be planning some of the things for 2021. George, I'm saying it here right now on your show. My goal for this work and for the betterment of victims and survivors is that we would host in 2022 a survivors conference.
Okay.
And I am looking for underwriters. We're looking for people to show up, support. I want a place where victims and survivors can talk together, heal together, share their journeys together, and also inform the movement together about where are we going in this work.
Well, okay, so I know you're a person of faith. Name it and claim it. What month in 2022 is this going to happen?
Oh, I think we should do it in August of 2022.
And it is done, right?
Thank you. Yes, it is so.
And it is so. VeraHouse.org, 468, area code 315-468-3260. You can get online to chat or call the 24-hour hotline. People are there, right there to help you right now. But we've been helped by two survivors who are sharing their truths, Marc Martin and Angela Douglas, co-chair of the Survivors Network, but Angela's also associate director of Vera House, with some news to come, but that's another story. We'll talk about that at another time. George Kirkpatrick, Inspiration for the Nation, thank you so much for sharing your truth and sharing your story.
Thank
You're
you for
very
having
welcome.
us.
Thanks for having us.